I'm excited, everybody, to open up our first international seminar on educational technologies for the 2021-22 academic year. For those of you who are new to this, the Educational Technologies program at the University of Haifa has been hosting seminars of this sort for over a decade now, but only in recent years we started to internationalize it so that we in Israel can widen our access to a broader set of ideas and of course contribute our own ways of thinking to the larger worldwide conversation. So we're especially honored today to have Professor Erica Rosenfeld Halverson, a professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with us today to open up our seminar series for the year. Aside from a long list of Professor Halverson's accomplishments, including way back a Jan Hawkins Award for Early Career Award contributions to humanistic research and scholarship, as well as many other awards and scholarships. Most recently, she's a co-founder of, I hope I say this right, Wuppensacker, a collaboration between her university and a theater that provides creative arts programming to public elementary schools. Recently, Professor Halverson has authored a book. It's the main focus of today's seminar. It's called How the Arts Can Save Education, Transforming Teaching, Learning as Instruction, as you've just been talking about in your Zoom rooms. So just the title alone for me is very mind-opening about the unique way we can think about education. I haven't read the book yet. I'm personally very excited to do so. I know many others here, some have even bought the book already, are very excited for the talk. So I suggest we get on with it. Erica, our attention is yours.
Wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all. Thank you, Yotam, for having me. Thank you all for welcoming me into your virtual community. As Yotam said, I am a professor here at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I'm also the current department chair in the department that is primarily concerned with teacher education. So I spend a lot of my professional time thinking about how to improve our programming around future teachers in Wisconsin and in the United States. And as Yotam mentioned, I spend a lot of my personal time thinking about how to build effective arts-based learning environments for young people, and particularly for young people who otherwise don't have access to the arts in their daily lives, which for many American public school kids is a reality. Fun fact, well, not so fun, interesting fact, in US schools, only about 3% of public schools in the United States have dedicated drama, theater, or dance teachers in their schools. So the performing arts in particular, but the arts in general have almost disappeared entirely from our standardized curriculum. And this is something that gives me great agita and that I have spent a large portion of my career trying to figure out a way around. And this book reflects a lot of the ideas that I have built and studied that try to rectify what I think is a great tragedy of American schooling, which is the lack of arts practices. So I'm going to read to you from the book. I'm an actor by training, so my hope is that that will be moderately interesting to you as you sit in your homes and in your offices. If we were together in person, that performance would be much more dynamic. Instead, I am sitting in the office in my apartment. So I'm going to read to you some ideas, some of which are academic, but many of which are an attempt to translate academic ideas into the practices that I care about, that I value, and that I write about. Wuppensacker is a community arts outreach program in Madison, Wisconsin, and I am its self-proclaimed mayor. From the Dictionary of American Regional English, Wuppensacker is an old Wisconsin word that refers to a special version of whatever noun you are talking about. If you've ever spent time in the upper Midwest, of the United States, you would not be surprised to hear someone say, "Oh yeah, we had a whoopin' soccer of a party last night. It was a real good time." The word is simultaneously silly and local. In our Artist in Residence program, teaching artists work in community with elementary school students and classroom teachers on creative expression through storytelling, writing, improvisation, and theater performance. We spend 7 weekly sessions working with an entire grade of students to produce stories across a range of storytelling formats. The climax of the program is a performance by professional artists that features a selection of the kids' stories. We perform during the day for the entire school, and then again in the evening for families and communities who bear witness to the genius of our young writers. This program embodies all of the good ideas that I have ever had, heard, or read about how arts practices shape learning and teaching. In this whoopin' soccer of a program, we engage in telling, adapting, and performing stories. This is the core of what we do, and it is the core of any design for an arts-based learning environment. Telling stories looks a lot of different ways. It looks like a teaching artist crouched over a giant piece of lined paper, fielding suggestions from 9 third graders about what to name the unicorn that is the hero of their story. Spoiler alert, his name is Sparkletoes. It also looks like a trio of kids collaboratively writing a short play, where each of them scribes lines and stage directions in their own notebooks so that they can later perform these plays for their peers. It also looks like a kid sitting by themselves under a desk in the back corner of the room, creating comic book panels illustrating why kids should be allowed to make comics in school. Adapting stories also comes in many flavors. We are constantly adapting in the classroom. The third graders who wrote about the unicorn portray Sparkletoes and his friends and foes for the rest of their class. Kids read their stories out loud as teaching artists improvise their way through getting lost in the mall or driving from Madison to Chicago for cousins' birthday parties. Adaptation also happens in the rehearsal room, where professional performers flex their artist muscles by bringing in tools and skills from their lives outside of whoopin' soccer. Modern dance choreography, reggae music, and shadow puppetry are all regular components of our group of artists working together. And when we use our artistic tools, we only do so if it lines up with the kid author's intention. We ask ourselves, our fellow teaching artists, and the classroom teachers, whether our adaptation decisions honor what the kids were trying to express. Our performances of youth-authored stories simultaneously push on the norms for representation and honor the kids' voices. Our ensemble is purposefully diverse. We aim for kids to see themselves on stage and to subvert assumptions about who holds power in a given situation. We will cast a 17-year-old African-American ensemble member to play President Barack Obama, even as the character is teaching a group of kids, all played by performers ages 35 to 60. When it turns out that this ensemble member also went to the elementary school we are performing in, well, he becomes a local celebrity. The whoopin' soccer model is the foundation of my story for how the arts can transform education. The age of accountability in education is losing its momentum. Education is in a time of profound change. We are increasingly aware of how learning outside of school provides life-giving opportunities for our most vulnerable kids. The arts, dance, theater, music, the visual arts, and the digital and design arts offer us a way to reimagine what good learning and teaching are and how to design learning environments that work for all kids. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down schools and exposed ever-present inequities in education. And though it has been heart-wrenching for teachers, students, and families, the disruption has also offered us the opportunity to fundamentally rethink what education can be. Gloria Ladson-Billings has called for a hard reset on education and for us to fundamentally reconsider the kind of human beings we want to produce. In this book, I describe how the arts can save education by providing new models for learning that embrace the social, cultural, and historical assets that kids bring to the classroom. I also share how an arts-based approach to teaching focuses on risk-taking as the most important aspect of a successful classroom. I offer a framework that leverages how arts practitioners do their work to design learning experiences for all subject areas. Throughout, I use my own arts organization, Whoop and Soccer, as a model for how to reframe learning as acts of metacognitive representation, identity development, and collaboration, and lots of joy. Before we get started, I want to make a few things clear. Mine is not a book about arts education. There are many fine books on how to teach the arts, both in and out of schools, and I encourage you to read them all. What I am offering is something more. I use arts practices to fundamentally rethink what learning outcomes we should value, how we should teach, and how to design learning environments and experiences that can serve all kids. In my world, we are not teaching and learning the arts are teaching and learning. I use terms like arts education, arts practices, and art making throughout the book. Across all of these, I am referring to the arts as a collective set of disciplines where people produce things. Those things can be physical artifacts like clay pots or short films, or they can be ephemeral performances like a music concert or an improvised scene. Many of my examples are drawn from the performing arts because I have been performing my whole life. But this argument is inclusive of all forms where creative expression is involved. Okay, on with the show. My approach to describing the power of telling, adapting, and performing stories for Whoop and Soccer City's citizens and for all those who participate in arts practices begins with three theoretical perspectives on education research: cognitive science, the new literacies, and culturally sustaining pedagogies. Cognitive science is the ground floor, where education researchers define thinking, knowing, and learning. The field has examined knowing and learning from the cognitive perspective, what's going on, quote unquote, inside people's heads, and from the sociocultural perspective, in the social, cultural, and historical interactions that are characteristic of the way people engage with one another in particular contexts. Specifically, I'm interested in the branch of cognitive science that describes thinking as distributed, stretched across people, tools, and time. Best practices in the arts connect directly to social, cultural, and historical models of cognition and show up all throughout Whoop and Soccer City. The new literacies. What could be new about literacy? Don't you just mean reading and writing? Actually, no. Folks who work in the study of literacy now understand that being literate as ways of knowing, doing, being, seeing, valuing, and believing, all of which are embedded in the things we consume and the things we create. In this way, art making is a literacy practice aimed at communicating thoughts and ideas to real-life audiences. Culturally sustaining pedagogies is a foundational set of commitments in education research that teaching starts by connecting kids' worlds and valuing what they bring to a learning environment. This is of the utmost importance if our goal is to work with all kids. Some people also call this asset pedagogies, meaning starting with what kids bring to learning, as opposed to a deficit orientation, which focuses on what kids lack. The arts are a natural fit for cultural relevance, and this scholarship has been foundational to my understanding of how art makers, young and old, shape what good learning looks like. Arts practices where people learn to make things serve as a bridge across all these big ideas in education research: cognitive science, the new literacies, and culturally relevant and culturally sustaining pedagogies. Cognitive science describes learning by making, where people use available tools and resources to work through difficult ideas, while the new literacies focuses on learning in making, that is, learning in the act of designing representations. In both framings, learning by making and learning in making, making things is an opportunity to capture, represent, and share issues of culture and power. So it is more than just making things. We make with and through a critical lens, where critical implies attention to the role of power, inequality, and marginalization in discussions of teaching and learning. Creating artistic representations that feature youth experiences, perspectives, and values brings together these three foundational education theories around what kids are learning to know, do, and be. It is day one of our Whoop-n-Soccer residency at Imagination Elementary. We have not yet settled into the routine of knowing who will push whose buttons, who will run off to right under a table as soon as they get the chance, and who will permanently attach themselves to teaching artist Amanda R., who, a student once told me, looked just like Princess Jasmine, only prettier. As teaching artists, we meet in a small room off the school library to plan how we're going to spread ourselves across the 70+ third graders at the school. There are typically 3 classrooms of kids, and this year, the classroom teachers have put the kids into mixed classroom groups. You can tell this is before COVID because they're mixing kids into different groups. We've worked with these teachers before, so they know what to expect from us. They have put the kids into a mellow group, a rambunctious group, and a group that is already super enthusiastic about writing and performing. I take the rambunctious group with co-teaching artist Brian, who has just returned from performing in a national tour of a musical to do some directing and teaching in town. I love when I get to be in a room full of third graders who teachers see as rambunctious. They are often the most enthusiastic about performing, but the most challenging to get to work together. And the classroom teachers we are partnering with are simultaneously curious and amused by what we will do to work successfully in the room. Today, our mission is to get the class to embrace the Whoop-n-Soccer 5 agreements. These are the foundation of our collective work together the way we set up what it means to be in community. We set up the agreements under the banner of Whoop-N-Soccer City, the place that is created inside each classroom that includes teaching artists, classroom teachers, and of course, all the kids. When we are in Whoop-N-Soccer City, we structure all of our interactions around the agreements. Originally, we called these agreements rules, but quickly realized that this framing felt like we were creating a city ordinance rather than coming together to build a new learning community. We present these agreements and then ask every kid in a small group to recite the following. I agree to these agreements that we have agreed upon in agreeing to work together. Then they approach the written agreements posted on the wall and sign their names, which remain visible throughout our time together. Whoop-N-Soccer agreements. 1, every idea is a good idea. 2, support each other's ideas. 3, respect yourself and others. 4, keep the peace. 5, respect the magic sign. If you have ever been in any acting or improv class, the first thing you will learn is the importance of saying yes and. This is my top priority for kids working with Whoop-N-Soccer, that they should say yes. Yes to themselves, to their own instincts and ideas, to the ideas of others, and to what can come out of taking our collective ideas to create something new and magical and strange. No but chills interaction immediately and makes participants withdraw or become defensive. Yes, and on the other hand, gives us permission to build on each other's ideas, to take what someone is giving and make a collective new thing. Saying yes and is also the primary move for good teaching. It is the way to create a classroom where kids can share what they know, take risks, and learn new things. Yes, and builds on what we know about how people learn. And it is the arts that can show the way for incorporating creativity throughout teaching practice. In Whoop-N-Soccer, working with a group of kids to understand yes and gets you a long way towards the agreements. Every idea is a good idea is mostly about not censoring yourself. By 3rd grade, many kids have developed the notion that their ideas are no good, that they are not creative, or that there is an expected right answer, and whatever they say is not it. We spend a lot of Whoop-N-Soccer writing time just getting kids to express their first thought. Support each other's ideas extends yes and to collaborators. It is not easy to accept someone else's brainstorm and bridge it with your own, especially if you are 8 and working with a large group of other 8-year-olds. But getting kids to see the joy in riffing off of one another is one of the great victories of creating together over time. Respect yourself and others is a reminder of the first 2 agreements, but bears repeating. Because knowing how to be a human among other humans is hard. It's hard for adults, and it's hard for kids. We make it a goal of collaborative creation to finish out our time with an emphasis on self-respect and respect for each other and what we make. It is week 2 of the Whoop-N-Soccer residency, and we are writing stories from pictures. I am gathered on the floor with a group of 9 kids, a piece of oversized sticky note paper between us, and we are looking at a picture cut out of a magazine. It is drawn in a cubist style and depicts a jazz trio. They are likely playing a standing bass, a piano, and a drum set but the artistic style obscures exactly what instruments they are playing. We know it is jazz because the figures are wearing berets and sunglasses, and there are musical notes floating around their heads. We also know they are performers because the bottom quarter of the image features cubist versions of the backs of heads sitting in chairs, as if they are an audience watching the three musicians perform. In group stories, especially in early weeks, the teaching artist does the scribing while the kids provide the ideas. With a group of 8 or more, it is a good idea to both ask for volunteers and call on individual kids who may be less likely to jump into a group brainstorming process. Asks of individual kids can come in the form of specific questions. Cameron said there were 3 musicians. What do you want to name them? Or more general asks, how should we end this story? Sometimes, when everyone wants to participate, I go to a round robin style of participation where each kid gets a chance to share their idea for the story. The only rule of this process is that you cannot reject anyone's idea. Yes, and. You must build on what the person who spoke before you created. Here is what we wrote. 3 musicians had been playing jazz for 3 hours on their standing bass and 2 accordions when an audience threw an apple at Jerry Curry and hit him in the head. He passed out and hit his head on the stage. The other 2, Bob and Giannis, were happy because they secretly wanted him out of the band. Jerry was old, selfish, grumpy, ugly, creepy, and a bad musician. Bob and Giannis did Fortnite dances on his body. First they clapped, then they booed, then they called the police. After the concert, they arrested everybody, except for Jerry. They just left him there. The writing flowed pretty well. As you can probably see, I elicited some details, names of the musicians, for example, that likely came from a kid who hadn't yet participated. You can also probably tell that I allowed multiple kids to do some describing. Old, selfish, grumpy, ugly, creepy, and a bad musician is a yes and list if I ever saw one. Not incidentally, when we performed this story, the 2 people playing Bob and Giannis both referred to Jerry as old, selfish, grumpy, ugly, creepy, and a bad musician. Keeping this language intact during performance was essential. You can also see that I was asking for an ending, and I got several. I'm pretty sure when the police arrested everyone, I asked, but what happened to Jerry? Their reply, they just left him there, is a pretty great answer to that question. When we got to the title of the story, we had a bit of a tussle. We had one strong vote for the man who passed out, which led someone else to say the man who did not go to jail, with a late surge for the concert that ended early. Disagreement bubbled, sides were taken, and then I did what Shakespeare did. I offered 2 titles with an or between them to indicate that audiences could take from the story what they chose. Twelfth Night, or What You Will, is one of my favorite play titles of all time. I love the idea that we, as audience members, get to decide what to call the play. Thus was born The Man Who Passed Out Who Did Not Go to Jail, or The Concert That Ended 15 Minutes Early. The title itself became part of the experience. When we performed this story for the rest of the class, we made a big deal of the title, enunciating every word and splitting up the line between multiple kids. The most important component of a whoop and soccer performance is celebration. We aim to celebrate the creativity of our authors by recognizing and honoring their contributions to our collective art making. Every performance begins with a clear statement of the title and authors of the story. It is beyond joyful to announce a child's name and story, have them recognize that it is their story, and then hear thunderous applause and whoops from their peers and families. Often, that joy is in the form of laughter. We are not above poop jokes. In fact, we love them. We are also not above falling down, walking into things, using the comedic rule of 3, or any of the other tropes that elicit laughs from the young and young at heart. The dumb jokes are always the ones that bring the most joy. In the story, The Goat on the Tree and the Poor Farmer, our farmer loses his goat, played by a silly human who makes great noises but otherwise looks totally human, and can't find her. She is right behind him, trapped in a fake tree. But when he looks everywhere except where she is hiding, the kids go nuts. They scream at our hapless farmer, laugh hysterically, and continuously point at Goat Woman until eventually he turns around. These 30 seconds spark a lot of joy. I use the word joy and not hilarity because joy can also look like celebration. We celebrate individual accomplishments and contributions, especially when we know the writer is not often celebrated for their strengths in the classroom. Teaching artists get to know the kids over the course of 6 weeks together, so we often select stories from kids who shine in the whoop and soccer context, but may struggle in other parts of their school life. We also celebrate how difficult the world can be and how kids navigate those challenges. There was a gray day in the middle of March 2019, but it was a whoop and soccer of a day for me. I ran into my favorite kid from the rambunctious group as he filed into the school for his performance. Let's call him Jack. Jack has indeed been rambunctious, hard to keep still, eager to make jokes, and highly prolific as a storyteller. I was not involved in the making of the professional school performance. So when I showed up that day, I was thrilled to learn that Jack's story, called The Joe, was included in the show. I was even more thrilled to learn that Jack's mom would see the performance. This is possible because we let the classroom teachers know 2 days in advance whose stories we will be performing so that they can notify caregivers in case they want to come. I watched Jack see his mom, run over and hug her, and then go and sit on the floor with his friends. I talked briefly to his mom. She tells me that the school principal has sent a cab to pick her up. She is very proud and happy that she is able to see Jack's story performed. After the show, I am full of ideas and excitement. As a researcher and as a teaching artist, I have decided that I will interview Jack. We have a quick chat that I record on my phone to capture this moment so that I can remember how impactful the performance was for him and his family. Me. Can you tell me what was your favorite thing about working with Whoop and Soccer? Note, I am fully expecting him to say, seeing my story performed, or having my mom with me when my story was performed. Those of you who are researchers will know that thinking I can anticipate what an interview subject will say in advance is a serious error on my part. If I already know the answer to the question, why am I asking? Jack does not disappoint. My favorite part about Whoop and Soccer is acting out the stories. He replies with confidence, I am caught off guard. Though I am off screen, you can hear the surprise in my voice. It is what? Was acting out stories? Like being an actor in the stories? Yes. Jack says this as if I am the stupidest person in the world for not understanding him the first time. I am not satisfied with this answer, so I keep pressing. And then, how did you feel about seeing your story performed on stage? It was funny. It was funny. Was it what you expected, or was it different than what you expected? It was different. They added a little bit on. Did you like what they added? And they took a little bit away. Yeah? Can you say a little bit about what was different and what was the same? In my story, it didn't have the tea and the tables, and a dragon threw a car at Joe first. Scene. What can we take from this scene? After I scolded myself for thinking I knew Jack better than he knew himself, I felt excited. He took so much from Whoop-N-Sucker that seeing his own story performed on stage by professional artists in front of his whole school was not even the best part. Also, for Jack, having the chance to get up and do stuff in the classroom held a lot of appeal. Performing made him feel good. In terms of his own story, the level of detail he was able to provide on what was similar and what was different was pretty amazing. This was a story he had written 6 weeks prior to the show and not looked at since. But he remembered that in his story, the dragon started by throwing a car, as opposed to our version where the car throwing was the culminating event. Rule of 3, take 3 actions and save the most outrageous for last. And he noticed that we added the dragon having tea with Joe as he tried to tame the dragon. His own story had meaning for him, our adaptation had meaning for him, and he was actively able to articulate the differences between the versions. Luckily, I was not on camera during our exchange. I'm pretty sure I cried. I cried teacher tears for all he took from the telling, adapting, and performing cycle, and for how just 6 weeks of working in this process showed me what Jack could do. A quick coda on Jack. He came back to school that night for the evening performance of our show. We offer this second performance so that kids can bring their adults back with them, and we can open the performance up to the greater community. While the school show typically has about 300 kids and 30 adults in attendance, the evening shows have about 50 kids and 50 adults. The vibe is different. We print programs so the adults can see the stories for themselves, and the kids who come get to be super duper special. Jack walked in and I went over to say hi. I was very excited to see him back. "Hi, I'm Jack's mom," said a woman who was not the woman I had met that morning. I shook her hand, told her how much I adored working with Jack, and let them be. Besides, Jack had some other friends at the show and he wanted to sit up front with them. I was so moved that he felt proud enough to bring all of his moms to the show, and that the educators around him, his classroom teachers and the principal, knew that this kind of experience would impact them all. Now I made you cry. Our schools are in desperate need of new approaches to teaching and learning. Art-making spaces provide new approaches in the form of time-tested, proven practices for learning that draws on learners' identities and communities and allow makers to take control of their own learning. I do not intend to overwhelm you with specific arts practices that require years of expertise to achieve competence. Instead, I want to identify the pathways for ready access to arts practices that provide deep and meaningful connections to big ideas across disciplines. And though an educator's mastery of an art form is not required to transform learning outcomes, teaching strategies, or the design of learning environments, collaboration with those who do have expertise is essential. I can't promise you that embracing an arts-based vision for learning, teaching, and design will be easy. But the stories, examples, and ideas in the book can communicate to education leaders, policymakers, our colleagues, and ourselves how we use the arts and art making to bring joy to classrooms and to lead the way toward a more equitable and just educational future for all. Thanks. That's what I brought. So I'm hoping that there are questions or comments or discussions.
I'm sure there are many. I think I see a lot of people with a round of applause. You're spotlighted, so I can't see everyone. So let's unspotlight you for a second. But let's give her a round of applause. Where? Oh, I can't do this. I hear room spotlight. Okay, let's take a look at everyone. All right, can you see everyone now? Yes. So,
No,
Yeah, I
we see you.
can.
I don't know
Maria.
is this an international thing when people do this with their hands, or is this just something we do in Israel?
It's
No,
sign
well,
language. It's in sign
It's
language.
American. It's American Sign Language. I don't know if is it also
It's
Israeli
in
Sign
Hebrew
Language
also, yeah, in Hebrew
Mhm.
also.
or Hebrew. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Hebrew Sign. Yeah, this is also. This must be maybe it's a universal sign language
Maybe.
gesture.
So this is what
It's-
the thought
It's
that I
not
had.
universal.
Not universal.
No, it's not.
No, that sign, it's universal. The language is not universal, of course.
Erica, I have a thought here. There are some people here that a lot of people have questions, but for two reasons. One, it takes people sometimes a few minutes to kind of process their questions. And two, for some people, they might not feel as comfortable asking their question in English because for most people here, English is their second, sometimes third language. So I suggest we go into breakout rooms for a few minutes, give people a chance in small groups to talk, see what questions came up, what really resonated with you when you watched this, when you listened to this book, or to Erica read from her book. And then we come back and I think we'll be able to have a much richer discussion and set of questions. Does that sound okay?
That's wonderful. And also, I just want to say I have put in the chat the English spelling of the word Whoopenstalker. Because, you know, acknowledging our linguistic differences, but also, to be honest, this is not a familiar word in English either. Because as I said, it's a regional term, right? And even some of my regional colleagues, you know, said, what? What is the word? So that is how that word is spelled in English, just so you know, for folks' reference.
That's true. Whoopenstalker. It's new to me, and I've been to your area, your region.
The only person who was not us, who was familiar with this word, I was on Wisconsin Public Radio, and, you know, the oldest living, you know, radio host in Wisconsin was like, oh, I know that word. He's like 87 years old and lived in Wisconsin his whole life. And he was like, oh yeah, Whoopenstalker. No one else has ever heard of it, but Larry Mueller, Wisconsin Public Radio, knew the word.
You've revitalized it and brought it to
That's right.
our part of the world. That's great.
That's right.
Okay, so to everyone here, take the time to think with your group. There's going to be some people here from abroad, from I think California. I'll tell you when you come back, all those people from abroad. We have some people here from Levinsky College and others from just different places in Israel. Most people here are from the University of Haifa in our educational technologies program. But in any case, so in your groups, you're going to probably meet with one of them. So take the time also to introduce yourself. In 5 minutes, think of some good questions, and then we'll come back and we'll have a chance to ask them. So here we go. You're hearing my kids in the background making a lot of noise.
Your background does not betray where you actually are.
That's true. I'm in my son's bedroom. This is behind me is our learning space. We have a very nice space. We've been meeting online a lot this semester, but we have a very beautiful space that we use for our whole program, which is, as you can see, there's a couch here, there's a kitchen. This is the way we learn. So it's really,
It's wonderful. You know, I I teach this in the fall. I typically teach undergraduates, and I teach an arts integration course for future teachers and also future teaching artists. So artists who want to be in the classroom like me, and then also classroom teachers. And we talk a lot about the environment as third teacher, you know, and sort of from the Reggio philosophy. And they have so little experience with learning environments that aren't standardized classrooms that, you know, I take them a lot. We go on a lot of field trips. And not just like, oh, look at the space, but we go to the space and then we do arts-based work together in the space to work at the intersection of what a productive learning space and learning activities are. And then they're almost mad by the end of like, why have I been sitting in these crappy rooms with no windows and chairs that don't move for 20 years? What is this? Yes. Like it makes them realize all that the institutionalized version has not offered them.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. And it's amazing when there is a different space, how, you know, suddenly frees them to think in different ways and so on. So it's, yeah.
Yep. And even, you know, our college students, even our graduate students, frankly, right? I mean, especially those who've grown up.
Right, yes.
Well, you know, American classrooms, but we have a lot of students from China. And, you know, Chinese classrooms are purposefully non-creative spaces, right? So when you say, look, the purpose of this is joy and depth of engagement, they're like, I literally don't know what you're talking about.
That's not what school
like,
is.
Yeah. I mean, I've had Chinese undergraduates say to me, I've never thought about the word play in the context of learning. And this year I had somebody say, we went to do a dance workshop and we were going around at the beginning, sort of talking about the things that we were bringing into the space that make us anxious. And she said, I've never danced before.
Wow.
And I was like, you are a 20-year-old person. I'm sure you have danced, but the fact that you see yourself as a person who has gone through 20 years of your life and not danced feels very sad to me.
Yeah. I think unfortunately here, a lot of schools very serious and yeah, I mean, it seems oftentimes to take away that. And I guess everything that you're saying really brings to life a lot of these ideas that it should be fun, it should be joyous, we should be improvising, we should be performing, we should be applauding, we should be encouraging, we should be respecting. I wrote down all these great words. You should see my my table of my.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's really wonderful. Well, let me ask you a question. What question? Yeah, sorry. What question? I imagine you give these talks a lot. What question do you not get asked, but you wish you did get asked?
Oh man. Oh, that's an excellent question. I have to think more about. I mean, I guess I wish that people would start with the assumption that this is the right thing to do, rather than the questions I often get, which are like, so given that this is impossible, what are some little things we can do? Right? Everybody mostly starts with the ways in which this, you know,
this
remaking, right, this can't work. So I don't know if that's a question so much. Like I have to think about how that would be phrased in the form of a question, right? Like, I mean, maybe.
Bless you.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, and maybe again, this is a topic of conversation more than a question. You know, most education folks start with the idea that the outcomes are fixed
Mhm.
and they're open to tinkering around the process. I don't get a lot of pushback on that, but the end is always the same. Like, in the end, is this going to help test scores? In the end, is this going to better prepare kids for college? In the end, are we going to have more STEM practitioners? Like, whatever the outcomes are, there is much less willingness to ask how this changes what the outcomes of education ought to be, and some willingness to tinker in the process. But I think I am more radical than that. And I think many of us are more radical than that. And we are just looking for a way to represent that radicalism. I don't know. So that's not really a question either, but it's definitely like a perspective that I'm interested in talking about.
Okay, let's see if it comes up through the questions. So I hope you had enough time to think and to process and to come up with good questions. So does anyone want to just raise your hand and ask away?
It's pretty risky. Yes, Sahar, I'm very proud of you for raising your hand. This is a hard space to do that in.
Thank you. I would be shy, but it's very interesting for me and very relevant to my research. So I decided to move over.
Well done.
I love the approach, first of all, and I was very moved by it. And I'm wondering, how can you do it with older kids? First of all, second of all,
that's wonderful.
Sorry, you can answer first.
No, keep going. I'll take it in and think, and then you ask the second part.
Okay, and also, like, if it can be inside other subjects, like learning history, learning mathematics, due to this approach.
That's great. Thank you. Those are great questions and maybe related questions, right? Because as we sort of age up in schooling, we become more disciplinary in our practice, right? In elementary schools, we are open to the idea that kids are learning in a space together about core ideas that might cross disciplines, but we get to high school, we get to university, and it's like, no, this is a math class. This is a, European history class. And we sort of lose that multidisciplinary perspective. So one answer I have is that all learning environments ought to scaffold risk-taking as a core mechanism of what it means to do teaching and learning. So in my experience, both practically and from a research perspective, no one can learn anything unless they are willing to take a risk. And that means the risk, even as I said, of just raising your hand to ask a question in an unfamiliar space, right? Knowing there are folks in this room who you've never met before. I don't know what your status is, if you're a student or a professor or, an undergrad. I have no idea what your status is, but that status implicates whether you are willing to engage, right? And learning needs to be about being wrong. But no one is willing to risk being wrong if they don't understand that that is a core mechanism of teaching and learning. And so I spend a lot of time in the book talking about how improvisation, improvisation applies to, in my case, I learned it through the theatrical form, but for those of you who are musicians, right, improvisation is a musical structure. It's also in dance, but that improvisation gives us the tools to scaffold risk-taking in the classroom. And that is true whether you are working with 4-year-olds or 84-year-olds. I was telling Yotam, I teach undergraduates typically in the fall semester. And I can't tell you for how many times they have reflected to me how little in the rest of their schooling they have experienced ideas like, for example, risk-taking. So when I teach courses, I dedicate a fairly large amount of class time toward folks sharing that which is distracting them from participating in the learning space. That we start every class with a collective conversation about what is making it hard for you to be here today. We spend a lot of time learning who one another are, even something as basic. And again, I'm speaking from my experience in American higher education. I work at a very large university where people, there's 50 some odd thousand students. So people can be very anonymous. No one knows anybody else's name. And my feeling is, how can you learn anything hard if you have no idea who is in that space with you? So some of these very basic principles of improvisation, saying yes and adding something to the scene, for me, are all core pedagogical principles, regardless of the age of learners, and frankly, regardless of the subject matter. In American civics education, which I imagine is also true given the global situation we're in Israeli civics education, these spaces have become highly contested. It is very difficult I have a teenager, she's in high school civics right now. It is extremely difficult to try out ideas of any kind in a learning environment where you don't know how other people will respond to the ideas that you are putting out into the space. And not to be this person, although I guess I am this person now, I have a lot of ideas in the book for how to, I know now I'm this person, whatever, it is what it is, how to translate core ideas of art making into non-arts-based learning environments. What does it mean to engage, for example, in representation and meta representation, across disciplines, drawing on the arts as the foundation for what that can look like in the classroom?
Thank you.
Others can be as brave and take risks like Saha.
Yeah, I would like to say something. Hi, my name is Renana. Sorry for my English, please excuse me. But
You're wonderful.
Thank you. I'm
I was going to risk saying that I thought your name was Renana based on the Hebrew, which I read a very little of, but I'm embarrassed to say without the vowels. I was too nervous. So I was going to take the risk and then I backed off of it. So
yeah, I'll change it now. I was listening to you and now listening. My name is Renana. I'm a gymnastic teacher, education. So what in my I'm teaching elementary school, so I relate to a lot of stuff you said, because in my class, people need to try different type of activities, and they usually don't succeed in all of them, but they have to try all of them. And this is something that I talk with Yotam all the time, that many things that he's saying about the new learning I see it in my class when I'm teaching. And this is now, not talking about something different. I learned something different. And it's something that we do have today in gymnastics, also in the high level, like in high school and middle school. Also, they can choose what they want to know, what they learn. They will fail while trying. They will not succeed, but their grade won't be based on their specific program that we try to teach them. If it's to throw as far as you can or to jump as high as you can.
I just want to add also that when I work with my own students, less so elementary students, because I think we acknowledge that young children have bodies. But frankly, the older our learners get, the less we acknowledge the body as part of the learning process. And, you know, I have my undergraduate students when I teach arts integration, and we do workshops of various kinds, including dance workshops. And when students reflect on those experiences, they almost always say, it is nice to be reminded that I have a body, or I forgot how much my body helps my mind, or, you know, how can we continue to think about the relationship between body and mind? And, you know, we know from learning sciences research that embodied cognition, it's a whole subfield of learning sciences research, right? And unfortunately, those ideas have been slow to make their way from theory to pedagogy, right? So I think theoretically, we acknowledge the role that the body plays in knowing and learning. Practically, we have not yet realized those commitments. Even with young learners, we acknowledge the body, but we treat it as separate from the mind. Here's the time that you run around. Here's the time that you think. Right? Rather than the thinking is connected to the doing in fundamental ways that is, when you think about it, is weird to be like, now's the time you move. Now's the time you think. So I just want to, you know, kind of say that I appreciate that you're working in that space, and you know, a nice dissertation project might be, you know, to think about how theoretical practices like embodied cognition can inform the ways you push on the pedagogy of, say, the gymnastics classroom. So nice work.
There are a lot of questions. So why don't, Erica, you go ahead and call people. I know there's also some in chat, and people even wrote to me saying they have questions, you know, so hopefully we'll have a chance for everyone, but why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Well, I will just speak briefly to the question about sort of resilience and future making, and say that there is a movement in US arts education to think about what we're calling social and emotional learning, which, you know, it's not my favorite acronym, because again, it implies somehow that social and emotional well-being and academic thinking are like separate things, right? To me, that's like, oh, you mean learning? Great, yes, we can do social and emotional, you know, but, you know, I think arts practices, because they are grounded in the assets that kids bring, are natural fits for the development of resiliency, because they don't reinforce the things that kids aren't good at. They reinforce the things that they are good at and give them additional tools and skills to allow them to highlight the things that they're good at. So, you know, I've been getting in trouble a little bit with academic colleagues lately because I've been trying to reject the sort of educational psychology concept of the intervention, which I know is like a standard languaging for a program that you introduce into a research or practice space. And the reason I don't like that, or I've come to not like it, is it is grounded in the assumption that we're trying to fix broken people, right? An intervention to me is like, we've identified the place where the thing is broken. We're gonna, and I know that that's not the intention of all people who design programs and projects, but the sort of behind it is this idea that like kids are broken, particular kinds of kids are broken, right? In the US, that is primarily Black and brown children, and children whose first language isn't English, right? We sort of say, oh, these are broken children. Here, we have an intervention to fix these children and put them back on the track with the non-broken children. And for me, this argument is in part about saying, get rid of all of that. Start with what kids have, because everybody has. Start there and build resiliency, build skills, build by starting where kids are. Someone had their hand up, but I wonder if this was the question instead. Intentionally choose storytelling instead of lecturing. 5 agreements belongs in any class. Yes, I do intentionally. I think of myself as a storyteller. And, you know, I think, is there lecturing in that? Probably. You know, I also like to call everything a game, even if it's not a game, because for a similar reason that I don't like to call things interventions, right? For those of you who are linguists, language is loaded, right? It comes with a whole set of ideas and experiences that people will bring to that work, whether you intend that or not, right? Like, is a lecture where everyone's sitting in a circle talking, is that a story? I mean, what makes it a lecture versus what makes it a story? So yes, you know, I try to be very intentional about the language I use to indicate what I'm hoping the interaction will look like and be. And, you know, I think the 5 agreements, I will say I didn't talk much about the 4th and 5th. Keep the peace is something that we do so that kids don't get too physical with one another. I don't know that that's necessary in a space with older students. It might be, depending on the space. And respect the magic sign, for those of you who've been elementary school teachers, is our quiet attention signal. So those 2 are more geared toward the kinds of learning environments that younger children find themselves in, but certainly every idea is a good idea. Respect each other's ideas and respect one another, you know, is all yes. I mean, I think we should all be, you know, saying yes to ourselves, saying yes and to the ideas of others, and thinking of learning as a collective, collaborative process that takes advantage of the best of what each of us brings into a learning space, and that is the foundation for good teaching and learning. And Osnat, I appreciate this combination, and I can point you to some really cool work happening in the US around the intersection of dance and physics. And I'm co-editing right now an issue of the Journal of the Learning Sciences that is coming out next year on learning in and through the arts. And there's a fabulous empirical piece in there by a research lab. I'm going to get the name wrong. It's something like embodied physics. It has those words in it. I'm not exactly sure. I think that might be a little bit wrong, but and they have studied at sort of a fine-grained qualitative empirical level how the way teens with expertise in different dance forms use dance moves to embody and understand principles of physics. It's super cool work. And, you know, I think dance has made in interesting ways, I guess, because of the naturalness of embodied understanding of embodied learning in dance, has made the most progress, I think, in terms of really developing interdisciplinary ideas about how the role of dance in understanding, interpreting, and making science and mathematical ideas. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at that work. It'll come out in the Journal of the Learning Sciences, but the lab exists somewhere on the World Wide Web.
So I saw Sahar, and I know Yael has questions that come also from her group. So do you want to answer Sahar and then Yael? Or ask, I'm sorry, Sahar and Yael? The other Sahar, right?
Yeah, hi. My name is Sahar. I wanted to ask you about what made you write the book, but you mentioned at the beginning. But I was wondering because I always compare. I studied in Canada when I was younger, so I always compare kind of education in Canada and here. And I'm not sure if Canada and America is also the same thing. But like I remember, we used to have dance. We used to have lots of interactions and lots of art, let's say. So I was wondering if schools also are the same thing in America or not.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have two answers. One is I think the question you were asking, and then I'm going to answer a slightly different question, which is like, why, Erica, did I write this book? I think, which you weren't asking, but I'll tell you anyway.
Love to know.
I think, so I have two answers. One is, and I have a little brief history in the book about American education policy from kind of the from sort of the mid 1980s until today. And the reason I do that, I'm not a super policy person, but there's a pretty clear line from some political ideology around education that started with a now quite famous report that the government issued called A Nation at Risk, which was a sort of alarmist look at how American children were faring internationally and how American children are behind and we're at risk of losing our competitive advantage. And that started in kind of the mid 1980s and then kind of climbed and climbed and climbed to about the mid 2000s when the Obama administration, with I think initially good intentions, developed this policy called the race to the top, which was a way to incentivize school districts to improve their kids' test scores as a mechanism for demonstrating that we were improving education. And that had all kinds of super terrible effects on kids, but also on the way we thought of what good schooling could be. First of all, for me, the race metaphor is really destructive. Like, why are we racing? Where are we running to? Why is it a race? I mean, I have all sorts of questions about the like metaphor of that and like what, you know, how destructive the metaphor is. But it also, because it had to be measurable, forced a reduction of what counts as good learning to your score on a math test and your score on a reading test. And that narrowing over that sort of 20, 30-year period pushed everything else out. So I can actually, it became obvious to me when my college students had grown up exclusively in that system, because college has become much more about unlearning those metaphors, right? So I get college students that when I have to teach them how to answer a question, because the only thing they think a question is for them to give me a right answer, because that's all they've done their whole school. They've been good little kids. They've, read the thing, they answer the question. So, I think some of that is the history of American policy. And I imagine there are some global parallels. So, the UK has always embraced creative arts more in its official curriculum. Australia, England, Ireland, but even these countries over the last 20 years have sort of gotten on the race train and had that sort of narrowing happen. And then just real quick, the reason why this matters to me is, as I spent the last 20 years with this sort of bifurcated life. I'm an academic, I write articles, 4 people read them, and I run a community arts outreach program. And I decided that it was time for me to try to merge those 2 worlds into a more singular way of talking about the things I know and value, because, it wasn't getting there. I mean, I don't mean to say for all of you who are writing dissertations, it's super valuable. You should all do it. I became frustrated by the lack of impact that my academic writing was having on the big problems that I really care about. And so this book is an attempt to translate those academic ideas into a more public, a piece that is more accessible to greater publics. So those are my 2 answers, one of which you didn't ask.
Thank you. Now I understood more.
Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Erica, for this super amazing talk. I was in a breakout room with Ziv and Moran, and we all loved your talk. We felt like we were in an audience in a performance, and we loved it.
Thank you.
And there were some questions, and Ziv and Moran, is it okay that I ask on behalf of the questions that you asked?
Of course, yes.
I'll answer on Z's behalf. He said his kid is, I assume now he's there, but anyway, he had to attend to his kids, but he said
okay,
yes.
So Ziv was wondering, how can you ever teach other teachers to do what you said that you did? And how can we have many classes work like this? And I think that this is a really big question that we all had. And then I had a thought that I want to share with you, and maybe you can relate to that in your answer. we have a center for research on citizen science. And one of the things that we do in citizen science is partnerships between students and scientists or other experts. And one of the things that you said in your talk and ring the bell to me was, hey, we need these kinds of partnerships with experts. So I don't know if that's part of the answer of how do you extend this and how do you teach others to do this, or do you need to teach others to do this? Or maybe we can, just create these kinds of collaborations, and the teacher will bring his or her expertise, the students will bring theirs, and the artist will bring theirs, and the scientist will bring theirs. So.
Oh yeah, Elle, that's such a lovely way of putting it. I mean, I think a huge component of embracing the role of arts practices is in not only acknowledging the distributed expertise, but taking advantage of that distributed expertise, right? And I wrote some years ago, again, in the line of you write an article and 4 people read it, about distributed instruction. And the article was based on the idea that we have distributed cognition, we have distributed leadership, but we still, it has not spread to instruction. We still think of the teacher as the singular expert who is required, and not to disrespect, Lee Shulman and the great scholarship of that era, but the notion of pedagogical content knowledge, I think, has been in some ways destructive toward that end. I understand the concept, right? But what it resulted in, I think, is this idea that to be a teacher means to contain all of the expertise that then becomes the foundation for how distributed cognition functions. And so, I think distributed instruction, which values the expertise of, in my case, teaching artists, but I think, science practitioners are another incredible resource. We think a lot, in the US, we have a large number, because the arts have been pushed out of the schools. There are now a large number of sort of nonprofit, out of school time arts programs and organizations that could easily work in partnership alongside classroom teachers, right? And could easily say to the teacher, anxious about scaffolding risk-taking? That's cool. We got it. You join in, right? Help us think about the ways in which our expertise is sort of collaborative. So I think one potential way forward is meaningful collaboration across everyone, right? I mean, I also think depending on the classroom spaces you're in, sometimes kids have that expertise, right? Like sometimes, there are especially after the last year and a half at home, I mean, kids know all kinds of stuff that is productive for these kinds of teaching and learning experiences. And so yes, I mean, I also will say very practically, I do run, workshops where I highlight some of the core principles of scaffolding risk-taking, because I do think sometimes it is helpful for groups of people to engage in that work together as the way to jumpstart it. So, I think there is space for collaborative workshopping of ideas independent of just making the partnerships. But yeah, I think that the partnership work is super important. And I will also say, I love the idea of scientists and artists partnering in particular, because I have been doing a lot of reading lately about how we can think about, I don't know, do you all have the STEAM concept? Is that a thing that you hear, a languaging you hear a lot? So we hear a lot of STEAM, and what that often means is what I would call put a bird on it. Has anybody ever watched the show Portlandia? It's a very American show. It's a comedy sketch show. It's about Portland, Oregon, which if you've ever been there is like a very particular cultural space. A lot of hippies, a lot of like wealthy hippies. Anyway, there's a sketch where they talk about a store where they sell very expensive upcycled items. And the whole sketch is called Put a Bird on It. Because their idea is like, you want a cool skirt? Just put a bird on it. You want to pay $500 for this box? Put a bird on it, right? And that happens a lot with STEAM of like, oh, we need some art. Cool, you made this science project. Why don't you paint it? Or, you need to learn about cell replication. How about draw it? Right? That these practices actually don't integrate or think meaningfully about the epistemological connections between what it means to do arts and do science. And so I love, but there's a emerging conversation about that, that I think scientists and artists can be really instrumental in moving forward. Interestingly, in the US, a lot of that conversation is coming out of Native American scholarship, because in many Native communities, there really is no difference between art and science. And so this articulation of why that is and how that is and what that might mean for the formalizing of those like epistemological understandings, I think is a really nice place to start. Again, not the question you asked, but I'm super interested.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. There are a lot of people here who I know they have families, kids they need to get to.
Yeah.
So with your permission, Erica, there's also a few people who still have questions. If you still have time, perhaps we can invite anyone who needs to go, and anyone who wants to stay totally voluntarily with you, but there's only if you have time for maybe 10 more minutes.
Yes, while people are leaving, I will just text the people that I'm supposed to meet at 10 o'clock and tell them that I will be a few minutes late. Yeah, so yes, is my answer. I also, Yotam has my email address. I'm happy to continue dialogues with folks via email. So, he is welcome to share my contact information with folks if you would like to have a chat. And I also understand asking sophisticated questions in a language that isn't your home language is really challenging. So if it is helpful to write a question down because that helps you express it in the way you want to express it, like I'm totally down for that. I totally understand that.
I don't know if you're not following the chat, but a lot of people are writing thank you. Just oftentimes atypical, after cases like this, which really I think demonstrates the appreciation they have for everything that you said in your talk. So it's really wonderful.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah, but let's give people a minute, maybe just to, I guess people can just go out. I'm actually one of those people that needs to also tend to my kids. So I'm gonna leave my Zoom open, but it might not be behind the screen. In any case, Noam, I think you had a question. So if you wanna go ahead.
Yeah, so hi, my name is Noam. I'm still taking Yael's first question, I guess. And first and foremost, I must say that your talk is truly inspiring, and I absolutely agree that children, they do learn better in a joyous and encouraging and positive, yes, and moving around environment, and all those superlatives that you just mentioned, because that is just great. And I'm not a teacher, but I wish that when I were a kid, if they let me do that, oh my goodness. But I'm interested on your notion of how to equip this somewhat abstract concept of producing identities and experiment with them, to pre-service teachers while they're still in their academic studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I have the privilege of working with pre-service teachers, so I have some experience in doing this, but I will say, this kind of telling and adapting and performing cycle, which I advocate for in the design of learning environments for children, I think is also appropriate in working with adult learners, because it is in this representational cycle that you have to wrestle with difficult concepts in a discipline, right? So there's the sort of concept phase of like, what is the idea that I'm trying to communicate? Yoav, you're making my life with having that little tiny human on the screen with us. So there's this, what is the concept? Then in creating representations of the concept, there's no more direct way to reckon with what the big ideas of a concept are than having to use a set of tools to share that back with others, right? In the arts, those tools are the tools of the art form, right? So I can give you, giving you an example from my own work in filmmaking, right? Ideas about, for example, how to frame shots. I can give you a specific example, which is also in the book. I was working with an organization that was having young people produce films about their identities. And this young woman wanted to make a film about, she was a very large, physically large, African-American young woman. And she felt that people had the wrong idea of her because of her size, right? She looked intimidating. People thought she was scary. And so in making the film, she used camera angles as a mechanism to get her audience inside those experiences. And so in making those kind of small representational decisions, that is, when to turn your camera this way, when to turn your camera this way, when to turn your camera this way, she was literally experimenting with identity representation and then getting an opportunity to have others give her feedback on what that representation meant to them and how that would influence her future representational decisions. And honestly, I think that process ought to be universal to all of our conceptual learning, right? And it's when we're doing science, when we're doing science right, that's what we're doing, right? And when we're doing mathematics right, that's what we're doing, right? Much of mathematics is the notational representation of difficult conceptual, 10 of them. I'm sorry, this young person is so cute, I can't stand it. Is a notational representation of complex mathematical concepts, right? And so it's only a small reframe, I think, to say to mathematics teachers, look, the purpose of what you're doing is giving students access to these notational systems as tools for representing complicated mathematical concepts. And many teachers, I think, of mathematics, that's what they're doing. I don't think honestly, I don't know that what I'm proposing, it sounds radical because it sounds like I'm asking everybody to do everything different. But actually, I think it is more an acknowledgement and an explicit statement about the importance of a representational cycle as a core mechanism for learning. And Now, how do you explain that to pre-service teachers? That's a whole other layer. I mean, I don't know if any of you all work with pre-service teachers, but the biggest challenge I see is because many of them are themselves undergraduate students, they can't get out of their own identity as student to step into the identity as teacher. You know, they can't get out of their own way, which is a separate question of like, can you train a 19-year-old to, you know, get out of their own way, which, you know, but I do, you know, in my pre-service teacher classes, I make explicit that they are engaging with different identities throughout the class. So I'll say, you know, in this experience, you're acting as learner. In this experience, you're acting as teacher. In this experience, you're acting as observer. And then we try to talk across, you know, what does this experience mean for you as a student? What does this experience mean for you as a teacher? What does this experience mean for you as an observer? I mean, it's one way to try to bridge those, but that's I think a particularly unique learning setting is the setting of pre-service teachers.
All right, we don't want to make you late for your meeting. So
they're like, yep, yeah, great. We moved it to Zoom. So, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Erica. That was awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate getting the chance to talk to new communities and meet new friends. Yay! The best. I just want to. And really, please reach out if you want to continue any conversations. And you know, I think I'm very. Just one final thing. I think I'm very American in my approach to all of this, and so I'm continuously curious about the ways in which these ideas do and don't make easy cultural translations. And so I was saying to Yotam at the break, we have a fair number of Chinese undergraduates and graduate students, and they say things like, I have never heard the word play used before in discussions about education or school or learning. And it's such a different context that I have had to rethink how I explain to them what I think play is and means in this context, and why they ought to begin to reframe their own understanding. So I'm always very curious about those sort of cultural ideas that do and don't port over, and how we can have a better kind of cross-cultural dialogue. So I'm excited about that.
Be careful, he might end up inviting you to come. So.
Oh my gosh, I would love it. I would love it. I've never been, so it would be an honor.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so
All right.
much.
Yeah.
Thank you, friends. Have a good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.